day as many of the survivors.
I felt at the time that because I'm Martin's mother, I was being held accountable in some way for all these crimes.
People up here. Yeah, Roger, about 3 more shots fired.
He always said he was never in Port Arthur at Broad Arrow. Came forward after, and people who knew Martin had known Martin for years, and they said, as far as they were concerned, they didn't recognise the gunman as being Martin Bryant.
A job like mine is I spend my time talking with people who have done terrible things. What you find are not monsters, but flawed human beings. Sad, pathetic man who had done something unforgivable.
What did you know? How much did you know? And when did you know? Why did you lie? Do you ever cry? Look us all in the eye.
Sergeant Terry McCarthy stated it was his belief that Martin Bryant was speaking from some sort of a script. Sergeant McCarthy also established that Martin Bryant had an accomplice, who Martin called Rick. At times it appeared as though Rick was running the show, and it also became rather obvious that Martin Bryant knew Rick quite well. There were over 20 times recorded in the police transcript that shots were fired from another room at Seascape Cottage, whilst Martin Bryant was talking with the police negotiator. The gunman firing those shots could only have been Rick.
When you practiced your shooting, where did you hold the gun?
On the left.
So you're left-handed?
I'm right with this hand.
Oh, that's right, sorry. Yeah.
No, this is more.
So if you held a gun, you would pull the trigger with your finger on your left hand?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right. And did you ever practice shooting from the hip?
No, never.
Though the internet is riddled with conspiracy theories questioning Bryant's guilt,
you weren't pressuring him, but it was a big thing in what you were trying to do, was to get him to plead guilty to all charges.
It seemed to me from day one that the evidence was so overwhelming.
he embezzled $500,000 from his law firm to buy art, a passion that became an addiction. He served 4 years in jail and was disbarred as a lawyer.
PM Derek Collier, in his police statement, stated, "When I was sitting down, I remember seeing this person enter the cafe. He came through the doors on my right. I noticed him because of his overcoat. I think it was green. It was a type of colour you don't see that often. That's why it stuck in my mind. I saw him carrying a long bag. It didn't seem unusual because all backpackers have long bags. He seemed to be somewhere about 20. He had long blonde draggled hair about 3 to 4 inches below the shoulder. He looked like he might have had a lot of acne. A pitted face."
Everyone who knew Martin Bryant agreed he had a flawless complexion.
My wife Elizabeth and I were both employees at Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority and were both working there the day of the massacre. My wife Elizabeth was murdered inside the gift shop section of the Broad Arrow Cafe, one of 20 victims murdered thereabouts. I know that Martin Bryant was not the gunman at the massacre at Port Arthur. How do I know? The coroner, Mr. Ian Matheson, wrote a letter to a number of survivors of the massacre informing us that Martin Bryant was not the gunman at Port Arthur. In the letter dated the 31st of January 1997, the coroner, Mr. Matheson, wrote, "As a result of the outcome of the charges against Martin Bryant in the Supreme Court of Tasmania, I write to advise I do not intend to resume the inquest that I opened on the 29th of April 1996. I believe it is not in the interests of the family, friends or witnesses to again traverse the factual situation in a public hearing, particularly when any finding I make must not be inconsistent with the decision of the Supreme Court." Well, I thought long and hard about this statement and discussed the point with friends. You must understand that there were many other facts of the shootings inside the Broad Arrow Cafe that begged a proper, open investigation, including workplace safety issues, and especially the issue of the emergency exit, that were totally outside the issues of the gunman. It was the simple fact that the coroner, Mr. Ian Matheson, believed that he could not make any finding that was inconsistent with the findings of the Hobart Supreme Court that really stirred me. The Supreme Court can only make the finding of either guilty or not guilty in the matter brought before it. It follows that for Mr. Ian Matheson's inquest into the massacre at Port Arthur to make a finding inconsistent with the Hobart Supreme Court, then the finding could have only been Martin Bryant was not guilty of the charges brought before him. For the coroner, Mr. Ian Matheson, to arrive at the decision not to resume the inquest into the death of 35 people that were murdered at Port Arthur, the massacre due to this reason, which he himself provided, and the coroner must have been aware that Martin Bryant was not guilty of the serious offences which produced 72 charges against police brought against him that day.
Tonight, victims call for a royal commission into the Port Arthur massacre. Alison Hembrough with ABC News. There's growing support from victims of the Port Arthur massacre for a royal commission or public inquiry into the shootings. They're disappointed an inquest into the tragedy has been abandoned, claiming many issues remain unresolved. These include concerns over security at the site and the issue of a locked door, which they claim may have cost lives. Despite a lengthy court process which led to Martin Bryant being jailed for the rest of his life, some of his victims claim there's still much to be resolved about that day. Wendy Skerr was a tour guide at the site, one of the first to begin treating the dead and wounded in the Broad Arrow Cafe. She believes a locked door in the adjacent souvenir shop cost lives.
If that door would have opened, I believe that at least 7 people that died in there would have had time to have got out.
Wendy Skerr is one of a growing number of Port Arthur victims calling for an inquest into the tragedy to be reopened. Stephen Howard is another. He lost his wife in the cafe. He's particularly concerned about security at the site.
There is no security at Port Arthur at this very present time, day or night.
2 weeks ago, the state coroner decided not to resume the inquest into the massacre. His decision, backed by the government, was based on the fact that Martin Bryant had pleaded guilty and the belief that survivors and families of victims would not want another raking over of the coals. For many, that's a very understandable reaction. But the coroner's decision has prompted a bitter response from two people who were closely involved on that day. Stephen Howard, whose wife was killed in the Broad Arrow Cafe, and Wendy Skerr, a former tour guide who attended to the injured in the cafe, want evidence presented publicly which they believe will show some people could have survived the shooting if security and safety issues had been addressed earlier.
I was very disappointed and very upset about the fact that there was going to be no inquest. I believed a lot of questions will be left unanswered unless this decision is reversed. I believe a lot can be gained by having this inquest. So many family members were there that day that lost relatives or friends, other people that weren't as directly involved as some of us were. A lot of questions need to be answered about what happened that day, what could have been prevented that day. I believe the whole nation will support this issue. The gun lobbyists, I believe they will be very interested in backing it as well, as it was raised last week in the media that the government had $50 million to buy back the guns, but yet couldn't find the money to have this inquest.
Very shortly thereafter, there was massive, loud, incredibly loud noise.
They fire a bullet, it's supersonic, so